Hi, good afternoon from London. I'm Inês Direito, and I'm a Senior Research Fellow at the Centre for Engineering Education, CEE, University College London. In this session, I'll present a systematic literature review of grit in engineering education research. The systematic literature review required a lot of collective grit. So before I start this session, I must introduce you to my wonderful colleagues with whom I had the pleasure to work with in this paper, Shannon Chance and Manish Malik. Both Shannon and I met Manish at a conference organized by the UK and Ireland Engineering Education Research Network, EERN, and joined forces around our common interest on non-cognitive skills to produce a publishable study on this topic. Since then, we ran one workshop at EERN 2018, which was very well received by the community, especially by early career researchers, and we're planning to present an expanded version of this workshop at CEFI 2020, the annual conference of the European Society for Engineering Education. In this session, I'll define the construct of grit, as it has been proposed and studied by Angela Duckworth. Secondly, I'll present the research procedures and the main findings of our review aimed to explore how grit has been studied in engineering education research. This review was published last year in the European Journal of Engineering Education. You can access the paper for free by following the short link on the slide. Finally, I will briefly comment on a few critical perspectives of the grit approach concerning its definition, cultural conceptions, and social inequality. Angela Duckworth is an American psychologist best known for her research on grit, which she defines as being a strength, a personality trait, resulting from the combination of two traits: passion, or consistency of interest, and perseverance, or perseverance of effort, for long-term goals. Passion is defined as the ability to hold the same interests over time. Perseverance is the ability to work hard and consistently towards a goal, even when experiencing setbacks. Duckworth and colleagues developed the grit scale to measure this construct. I'll show you an overview of this instrument in the next slide. In her research, Duckworth found grit to relate to both academic and personal achievements. For example, she found grit to be a stronger predictor of retention in military schools and a stronger predictor of achievement in spelling contests than academic measures such as grade point average or GPA. The grit scale was developed as a self-report instrument. Respondents are instructed to rate each statement using a 5-point Likert scale ranging between 1 and 5. To determine the grit score of a person, the self-reported result of each item on the instrument is added together, and this sum is then divided by the total number of items. A grit score of 5 is, therefore, the maximum value it is possible to achieve using the instrument, and would describe a very gritty person. On the opposite end of the scale, a grit score of 1 is the minimum value one person could rate and would describe someone who lacks grit. It is worth mentioning, as you can see, that the items that compose the grit scale are not specific to any particular life domain. Grit is thus what is called a domain general construct. In other words, it's not context dependent. The original version of the scale was published in 2007 and comprised 12 items, so all the items you see on the slide. In 2009, a shorter version of the instrument with 8 items was developed and published. The 8 items that compose the short version are displayed in bold. The 2 subscales of the instrument are assessed using the same total number of items and can be analyzed separately. We started this review because we wanted to know what prior work had been conducted in this topic, identify gaps, and new directions for further research. We then decided to conduct a systematic literature review because we were also interested in developing our research skills in this methodology. More traditional narrative reviews are often biased by publications availability and reviewers' selection. On the contrary, systematic literature reviews aim to reduce this bias by designing and following a comprehensive plan and detailed search process. We can say that systematic literature reviews are a research method based on secondary observations in which studies are the unit of analysis. It follows a procedure that can be reproducible. One of the key references in engineering education that guided this review was Borrego, Foster and Freud 2014 paper entitled Systematic Literature Reviews in Engineering Education and Other Developing Interdisciplinary Fields. The overarching research question that guided this review was, what type of studies have been conducted on CRIT in engineering education, and what were the main outcomes? We added complementary questions to better understand the target population, such as academic year and background, the methodological approach, and the instruments used. 3 types of databases were searched for publications in engineering education research. We started with the comprehensive and subject-specific database Engineering Village, since the intended focus was specifically on engineering students and not a wider population. Upon finding few publications of relevance to the question, the review progressed to using journal databases and finally databases of grey literature, listing conference papers and proceedings. In order to filter the publications for relevance, the search was limited to grit and education, yielding retrieval of 399 records. Following this search phase, duplicate records were removed manually and exclusion criteria were applied to select illegible records. To be included in this systematic review, papers were selected that both reported studies in engineering higher education and explored grit as a non-cognitive construct. A final set of 31 records was analyzed, first by abstract and then by full text. Of these 31 papers, 29 were conference proceedings and 2 were journal papers. 28 out of these 31 presented studies developed in the United States, 13 of which mentioned NSF fund, and 11 out of 31 papers presented collaborative research studies. The next step, after selection and identification of the primary sources, is what is called mapping. In this slide, I present a snapshot of how we organized the 31 records by 4 main characteristics: research topics, population, methods, and instruments. Most of the studies aimed to understand the impact of grit either as a predictor of academic success, such as the impact on grades, learning outcomes, and performance, or as a predictor of persistence and retention. The majority of the analyzed papers were conducted exclusively with first-year engineering students. 10 papers reported data collected from students at more than 1 year of study, 2 papers reported studies with women only, and other 2 papers included both students and academic staff. With just a few exceptions, most studies implemented quantitative methodologies to assess grit. Most papers presented average scores for grit as a result of having used one of the versions of Duckworth's grit scale, compared different groups of students, and/or analyzed the relationship between grit and other significant variables, such as grade point average or conscientiousness. These studies used correlation or regression analysis, and other quantitative methods to analyze grit were cluster analysis. 4 papers assessed grit using qualitative methodologies, mostly interviews, and then used grounded theory and IPA, but also students' journal entries and observation. 3 papers reported mixed methods, for example, combining grit scores with interviews. The most frequently used grit instrument was Duckworth's short version, followed by the original scale. However, 5 papers that reported having used an instrument did not specify the name and version of the grit scale. One paper asked students to rate themselves regarding a set of grit statements, but no mention to an existing or standardized instrument was made. Following mapping, the next step is synthesis, involving critique within and across studies. From the various synthesis methods available, I present here a thematic synthesis based on how grit measures were used and analyzed. Categorization. Grit was used to identify different groups of students in relation to their academic performance and attitudes towards failure in a required module. Comparison. One of the most consistent findings across the reviewed papers has been that newly enrolled undergraduates are generally grittier than students in more advanced years, and that women are grittier than men. Yet, there is a lack of longitudinal and mixed method studies available to explore these patterns in ways that lead to clear and robust findings. Correlation. Most quantitative studies explore the relationship between grit and academic performance, retention in engineering degrees, and other non-cognitive traits. Test impact. Finally, students' grit was measured to explore the impact of a program to develop students' preparedness for work and a program for professional development. The results of this systematic literature review yielded one main conclusion. The research on grit in engineering education is inconsistent in their methodological approaches and findings. This is quite common in engineering education research, as stated in this quote by Borrego, Foster, and Freud, because there are not enough studies of similar design out there. This poses limitations to the interpretation of findings across the set of studies included in this review. This inconsistency is reflected in different conceptualizations of grit and in different data reporting practices. In quantitative studies, different versions of Duckworth's test were used. Some studies did not clarify which version was used, and other studies have assessed grit by focusing on just one of the subscales, and in most cases, perseverance only. The studies that provided split scores for the 2 grit subscales reported lower scores for passion compared to perseverance. These findings leave space to further explore the role of passion in engineering education and its role in student performance. This might also suggest researchers are interested in specific subscales of grit, or that Duckworth's grit scale might not be the best or the most relevant instrument for assessing engineering students' grit. Qualitative studies that explored definitions of grit have found that, for engineering students, grit means being hard worker and resilient, and that grit is associated with short-term motivation. These findings suggest that engineering students' conceptualizations of grit do not consider consistency of interest or passion and perseverance for long-term goals, which contradicts Duckworth's definition of grit. P-values and effect sizes were missing when comparing different populations of students, for example. So we really need better data reporting practices. It is important to mention again that most papers selected for this review were published in conference proceedings, with findings usually presented as being preliminary or parts of larger and complex research projects. Although this review has not included all types of grey literature, it has identified grit as an emergent field in engineering education research. The review indicates that grit in engineering may not be studied in other parts of the world to the extent that is being studied in the United States. Based on the analysis conducted for the study, we have identified several promising avenues for further and future research. Grit, as defined by Duckworth, is not specific to any particular life domain. Recent studies have found that, for example, school-specific grit was a more valuable predictor for GPA than domain general grit. These findings encourage further research to assess domain-specific grit in other fields, such as engineering. So we could explore this by asking respondents to answer items separately with respect to particular contexts, in our case, engineering education. The broad literature suggests that perseverance alone is a better predictor of academic performance than the overall measure of grit combining passion and perseverance. We also know from the few studies that reported separate scores for passion and perseverance that engineering students score lower for passion compared to perseverance. These findings leave space to further explore the role of passion in engineering education. What does that mean? Finally, working in teams is core to engineering practice. How do groups of engineering students keep passionate and interested about their team project and persist working on it over time? It would be interesting to understand how teams' grittiness relates, for example, to co-regulated learning. The systematic literature review was also useful for finding research practices and shortcomings, and what we as a community could do to report our research in a better and more reliable way. In order to better contribute to the advancements in the field of research, studies need better reporting of both instruments and retrieved data, even when they are presented as work in progress or in conference proceedings. In the next final slides, I would like to comment on a few critical perspectives of the grit approach regarding the construct itself, cultural conceptions of grit, and social inequality. Literature on personality and individual differences has consistently found positive correlations between grit and conscientiousness. Conscientiousness is one of the big 5 personality traits associated with terms such as hardworking, reliable, and persevering. This suggests grit is not a totally new construct. According to some authors, grit might be a case of old wine in new bottles. On the other hand, in a relatively recent meta-analysis, the predictive power of grit on academic success was found to be quite small compared to other factors such as GPA and other measures of cognitive ability. In addition to this, another review concluded that individual scores for perseverance predict performance much better than either passion or the overall grit, so the combination of passion and perseverance. This questions the construct validity of grit as being composed by 2 distinctive factors. Considering non-cognitive factors more broadly, Turiel, Chung, and Carr argue that psychological research needs to focus on understanding how individuals think and behave in specific contexts, rather than following a deficit approach. In response to such concerns, new models have been developed to improve the measurement of grit in non-Western cultural contexts that are known to be more collective-driven. One example is a triarchic model of grit scale. This model includes a third dimension of adaptability to situations that refers to an individual's ability to adjust effectively to changing circumstances in life. Another major critique is the notion that a grit narrative focused on individual effort and individual achievement is detrimental to diversity and inclusion, as it helps to perpetuate inequalities embedded in the education system that are totally out of the control of individuals. So if you are interested in this topic, I leave here two references that are very interesting. I will leave you now with some final thoughts. So overall, the construct of grit seems to have different definitions in engineering education. In many cases, it has been defined as a synonym of perseverance, which disregards the other side of grit, passion. This highlights a need for greater precision and specificity regarding the study of grit within engineering education research and across education research more broadly. Also, we as a community need to adopt a critical perspective regarding grit, how it is measured, and what it means for engineering students, educators, institutions, and the wider society. Thank you for listening, and enjoy your virtual coffee break.